Our scripture reading today is from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 8 through 29. You have not come to something that can be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers beg that not another word be spoken to them. For you could not endure the order that was given. Even if an animal touches the mountain, it shall be stoned to death. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. See that you do not refuse the one who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused the one who warned them on earth, how much less will we escape if we reject the one who warns from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heaven. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of what is shaken, that is, created things, so that we cannot be shaken may remain. Therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom which cannot be shaken, let us give thanks, by which we offer to God an acceptable worship with reverence and awe. For indeed, God is a consuming fire. David, I was going to talk about him a little bit before he had an opportunity to preach. David has preached for us before, but I haven't been here when that happened. So I just want to say there's not one term that defines my relationship with David and Ann Hendricks. David came to South Bend to Prince of Peace Church of the Brethren from Quinter, Kansas. He was my mentor when I did an internship at Prince of Peace in 2009, 2010. His son, he and Ann's youngest son, Stephen, is married to our daughter, Becca. And David and Ann get to spend 4 days a week with our granddaughter, Anna. So they are mentors and colleagues and friends and babysitters and co-grandparents for us. So I am so grateful for David coming and filling in today so that I could go to California if needed. And David, we look forward to your message. God bless.
It is a joy to be back here. I know that when Mary Ann called, it didn't take me very long before I sent Rosanna what she would need, because I knew that under those conditions why it was important to get the plans done early. Raise your hand if you took a trip this summer. Keep your hand up if you went outside the United States. How many of you traveled outside the United States? No one. Okay. Well, I'm guessing that the reason for that is that it's a little harder to travel outside the United States. You have to have a passport. You have to really do some serious planning if you're going to leave the country, don't you? It's just not something that everybody does, and clearly I'm right because none of you did it. But where's some of the places you went in the United States? Raise your hand again if you went someplace and tell me where you went. Where'd you go, Betty? Where'd you go? Arizona, okay. Northern Arizona. Somebody not go to Arizona? Michigan. And where'd you go? Ohio, okay. Pennsylvania. Stan. Colorado, that's a great place. We went to Colorado too this summer. Where did you go? Florida. Boy, that's a long ways from here. Where'd you go? Oklahoma. Wow, hot and dry there. We went to Kansas and Colorado and Nebraska and California and Georgia and northern Michigan, Minnesota. We were going to go to Minnesota, but those people weren't going to be home, so we decided not to go up there. How many of you used a laptop or a smartphone to help plan your trip? Oh, several. And probably, some of you probably, did you use it while you were on your trip? Yeah, just like me. See, I used to go to the AAA office, and when I go to the AAA office, they would give me maps and guidebooks, and they'd really give me everything I needed to be sure that I was going to have a good time on my trip. And if I was going to travel someplace where I didn't know the roads very well, I would even have them make me a triptych, which would tell me certain things I could look for as I would travel. And I really liked those, and we don't do that anymore because it turned out that a lot of that information was out of date by the time you would get to where you were going. But it was always interesting to go into the strip mall, and they'd have these huge murals and of nice beaches, and usually something of Hawaii and something of Alaska, and places in Europe that you could travel. And it's fun to go in there and see all the places that you wouldn't be going. But the agent would give you lots of information that would help you, and they would help you get to where you were going. But now we don't do it that way. When I plan a trip, I'm usually going to go to TripAdvisor. Now, some people like Yelp, and other people use Google, and there are lots of apps that you can put on your technology that will help you find places to stay. But I go to TripAdvisor, and my username on TripAdvisor is Jawhawk Irish. Okay? So that's where the name for the sermon comes from. I'm Jawhawk Irish. If you want a good review, and if I've been there, read it, and I'll tell you the honest details that you need to know. But now that I'm retired, when I return from a vacation, I usually sit down at the computer and write 4 or 5 reviews over places I've been to let people know the latest scoop on that restaurant, or just what kind of experience I had when I was there. And it's kind of interesting. I wrote a bad review for a restaurant in Chicago, and they sent me a free meal. Well, why would I want to use that? I didn't have a good time the first time. I wasn't going back there. Even if they were going to give me a free meal, I wasn't going back. I wrote a nice review for a restaurant. One time they gave me a free dessert. I did go back and have that. One time this was down in Dayton, where some people used to live that are here this morning. I wrote a kind of not a real nice review of a hotel I stayed in, and they actually contacted me by email, and what would it take for me to be happy? I said, well, if you gave me some points for my I belong to their I don't know what they call it, their rewards program, and they gave me enough points that I could go back there again. And I did. I went back again because I like to visit my family there, and I go there, and I had a much better time. Wrote them a nice review, told them how nice they were to give me free points. So they didn't give me any more points but so with the advent of GPS, I don't use my maps anymore, but I do take an atlas along, because sometimes the GPS just takes you to the darndest places that it doesn't seem like they know where you're going. And I can tell they don't know where I'm at, and then I have to get my atlas out. Some people are never satisfied with anything. They complain constantly about little things. And some of the reviews you read are just positively not helpful at all, because all they want to do is gripe and complain. I usually tell people, like, for instance, if you're going to go to North Manchester and you're going to eat at the Pizza Hut, don't sit clear back there in that back room where the air conditioner is going to blow right on your back. It's going to be cold and you're not going to have a very good time while you're there. I know, because my grandkids cried the whole time. And so that's just not where you want to sit when you go there, because they're going to be cold and then they're going to make it not nice for you. Bottom line is that despite all the advice you can get about particular destinations where you might travel, you still have to go there. You have to experience it for yourself to really know what it's going to be like and how you're going to feel about it. I noticed this yesterday. I was at Nom Nom Full. I haven't written a review from yesterday, but I have written a review in the past when I went there. It's downtown in South Bend, and on the wall when you walk in, there's a little owl from TripAdvisor. They encourage you to read TripAdvisor to see what people tell about it. And I don't know if you knew this, but the TripAdvisor logo has an owl on it. And the owl has two eyes. A red eye means don't go there, and a green eye means go there. It's pretty easy, right? Green, go. Red, stop. Don't go there. So I find that pretty helpful. Choosing wisely is an art form. It helps you on your journey, and that leads us to the passage from Hebrews, because there we're talking about a different kind of journey. The kind that a TripAdvisor review might be helpful, because there's two very different destinations involved in this passage. You won't necessarily need a guide, but it doesn't hurt to have one. The writer recognized that the whole Bible is a story about a journey that God's people are on. The writer recognized that that journey begins in the Garden of Eden. He calls it the first Eden. And then this journey ends in the second Eden, he calls it. Well, there's a lot of things that happen along that journey. But the metaphor of the journey is a helpful one, because it tells us that the hero's quest is constantly something that is in play throughout the story. In Genesis, you encounter a man who leaves his home and leaves his country and goes to the place where God tells him to go. And he doesn't have any advice from AAA. He doesn't have TripAdvisor. He can't read any of my reviews to know what it's going to be like before he gets there. But he goes from Ur to Canaan, takes a side trip to Egypt. He comes back again. Then his grandson Jacob also goes to Egypt. Egypt is a popular destination in that part of the world. And they don't go there to see the Great Pyramids, although they were probably being built about that time. And then he's reunited there with his lost long son Joseph. Centuries later, after that, Jacob's descendants travel from Egypt into the wilderness, led by Moses. And for 40 years, they land. Now, to me, that's a long vacation. 40 years traveling with somebody. It's amazing, isn't it, that they kept following him for 40 years. But they go to the Promised Land. There were a number of reviews. Most of the reviews of the Promised Land were pretty negative. But there was Joshua and Caleb. They brought back some positive reviews and thought perhaps this could work out for us. and they emerge a new nation. And they push on to the Jordan River. Now, centuries later, their descendants were unwillingly carted off to Babylon. And the journey continues for these people. About 70 years later, they come back. Again, it's a long vacation. Well, not really. It wasn't very much fun, was it? Centuries later, there's Jesus. And you have the gospel readings from Luke throughout this year. I don't know if Rosanna preaches from the lectionary, but if she does, the lectionary from the gospel this year is the Gospel of Luke. And the narrative there chronicles Jesus' journey to Jerusalem, where we know the end of the story already. Then, finally, we have the journey that we read about in this text today. Diane said she had to read it several times. I did as well, Diane, so don't feel bad about that. It's not an easy text. But here you have the journey of the Christian and the church. And it's compared to a sojourn in a strange land. So as believers, we understand that the world is a temporary home, that our true citizenship lies in God's kingdom, the New Jerusalem, which is described in the text. It's a destination to which we travel. We're on a journey towards that destination our whole life. Joan Baez and Emmylou Harris sang an old country song from southern Appalachia that sounds something like this. I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger, a traveler through this world of woe. But there's no sickness, no toil, nor danger in that fair land to which I go. She goes on to say, I'm going there to see my father. Many of us have lost our fathers. Going there to see my mother because we've lost our mothers too. I'm only going over Jordan. I'm only going over home. I always like it when I get in my car, I can just turn on the navigation and say home. And I know that that will take me there. If I just do what they say, I'll get there. I don't have one of those buttons. It'd be easy. Wouldn't need church boards, wouldn't need pastors, wouldn't need, I don't know what we just need a button that says home, and that'll help us make this journey. But before we get there, it'd be nice to do maybe a red-green comparison about these things. In verses 18 to 24 today, the writer contrasts the quality of Israel's physical and material journey to their encounter with God at Sinai during their Exodus journey. And he contrasts that with the quality of the spiritual journey that Christians are on toward the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. One, on the other hand, is a journey, it talks about fear, talks about foreboding. And then on the other hand, the reviews seem to be like a 5-star review. I mean, it seems like everything on this heavenly journey is pretty good. In verses 1 and 2, after reciting a litany of the faithful in Israel's history, the writer urges his readers to repeatedly press on with the journey of faith. He says to them, run with perseverance the race set before us. In verse 1, he says to run with Jesus, who we know endured the journey to the cross. In other words, when we travel, we should let Jesus be our example, our guide. A lot better guide than Jawhawk Irish. In verse 12, the writer encourages the people with these words: "Lift your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed." Now, I read this with a new appreciation this year, or this week, because this year, in February, Ann's leg mysteriously was put out of joint. And what I mean was, she broke her hip. She didn't know how it happened. We still don't know how it happened. We know her hip was displaced. We know that there was a lot of pain involved with that. And she did get a complete new hip. And during that time, I was real busy making sure her weak knees had a straight path to walk on. And made sure she had her walker when she needed it, even if she didn't want it. In other words, sometimes the journey that we are on is a rough one. Not always one that we choose for ourselves. Things happen to us that we weren't necessarily planning on this journey. And the destination, although we're told is worth it, sometimes it's hard to see a destination if you have too much pain. You know, and despite our efforts to control things by researching and planning and trying to read reviews and get all the information we want, sometimes we still can't control everything, can we? Things happen to us. Hebrews says our God is a consuming fire. Now, I told Diane this, that the first paper I wrote when I was in college, after I decided to major in religion, was about this man, the ancient church father Origen. He says, it's as if God's essence were fire when he comments on this passage. It's not maybe an image that we often think of God. But it is important, I think, to keep a sense of awe and of perseverance in mind, and not to see the journey as a burden. It's not a repeat of the old Exodus, which was a pretty tough journey, one that earned a lot of bad reviews by the Israelites. The journey to Mount Sinai via the desert was towards something that can be touched, we're told. That it was characterized by blazing fire, by darkness, by gloom, and by a tempest, whatever that means. These aren't generally the kind of descriptions that you would choose for yourself in your journey. A gloomy journey. Who wants that? Who wants to go where it's dark? My wife always wants to go to the beach. It's not dark at the beach. It's hot. But it's not dark. So, God gave the people the law of Moses on Mount Sinai. And while it gave them specific directions on how to live, it didn't really provide them with everything they needed in order to deal with sin in their lives. And it turns out they were prone to wander. They were prone to do things they shouldn't do. And they fell short of their destination. So even when they reached the promised land, they were still searching for something. They hadn't reached their ultimate destination. The trip was a necessary one, though, because it leads us to a different time, the time of Jesus that the writer of Hebrews talks about. He describes for us the journey of Israel and then presents us with an upgrade that was freely offered through the death and resurrection of Christ. And in order for us to appreciate that upgrade, we need to know what sin is before we can overcome it. We need to know that God is serious about dealing with sin before we deal with it. We need to know that God is holy and just and set apart before we can really worship God. To me, the idea that God is a consuming fire is helpful in so much as it explains why we worship God, because God's clearly different from us and clearly worthy of our awe and clearly holy. The death and resurrection of Christ opens the way for not only God's chosen people, but for all people to reach the destination that we all strive towards. In verse 22, it says, Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, is that destination. So, as your guide this morning, let me make a brief contrast between the two. Going to Sinai, expect to find fear, darkness, gloom, and tempest. Some might want to try that, but not such a great trip. Going to the heavenly Jerusalem looks like we might have some powerful experiences there. Some incredible sights. It describes them as innumerable angels in festal gathering. Secondly, we'll see the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. Those parents and those mothers and fathers I was talking about. And then to God, the judge of all. And then the spirits of the righteous made perfect. And finally, we meet Jesus, who is the mediator of the new covenant, the one who makes it possible for us to reach that destination. He speaks a better word for us than the blood of Abel, it says here in this passage. The review of this ultimate destination is pretty good. It's for those who persevere, though. It's for those who continue on the journey and who live a life of faith. It's not good enough just to read the review. To experience this destination, you have to heed the advice and actually go there. So here's some tips. The writer of Hebrews urges us to hear the voice of God. And just like those who heard it at Mount Sinai, we should heed what God says to us. For the rejection of God's word has dire consequences, it says in verse 25. God's voice shook the earth back then. Turns out God's voice still shakes the earth today. We left the Magic Kingdom in Anaheim, and we were sitting in the car, and I looked over at the driver, and I thought, what are you doing to the car? Because the car is shaking. And it turned out it was that earthquake that you heard about in California. So this little news about the earth not shaking has better has a better feel to me now than before I had felt the earth shake. That's a kind of a strange feeling. It says this kingdom cannot be shaken. That's good news, because certainly we live in a kingdom that seems like it's shaking all around us. Living in such a kingdom will require a change of culture, because when we're traveling, we'll need to learn the customs, the language, and the ways of being. Frankly, I think that's why none of us went outside this country. It's a lot easier to travel where you know the customs and you know the language and you know what to expect. In God's kingdom, the writer of Hebrews gives us things to practice in anticipation of our destination. The first is, in this new culture, it's really bad form to interrupt God and not listen to God. Secondly, we should express our thanks. The Christian life is a tough journey. The destination is worth it. Jesus provides us with a joyful approach to God and to God's kingdom. Jawhawk Irish will promise you one thing and one thing only. This is the one destination where all the reviews will be spectacular.